I know that everyone is tired, so it's going to be a little bit of a challenge today to try to get people engaged, especially because a lot of us have been working and serving. Um, but today we're going to make a bit of a transition from what we talked about in the last couple of times, which is the entrance of sin and transgression. We talked about last time how this idea of the recreation in the flood narrative was God trying to reset humanity. The big theme that we're going to try to look into today, which is trying to make some sense of connections, because a lot of people, when they look at Genesis, get kind of pulled into this trap of a lot of stories that seem to be very disjointed, that don't make sense together. And then some people even look at, for example, the story of Abraham or like Isaac and Jacob, almost as a bit of like favoritism. Yani, why these people? As if God favored them and God set them up to succeed, and then there's a favoritism. Like how does God make this idea of the covenant? So today we're going to try to make this story, and always I tell people things are better understood when you put them into a certain context, okay? And it's sometimes hard to understand what is the context of understanding the story of the covenant with Abraham, okay? Because based on this, we can understand everything that comes after it, because we're the sons of Abraham. So when we understand it well, we can go forward from there. So in general, as we talk about last time, the pattern of sin and rebellion, Adam and Eve's transgression, the idea that they transgressed, and we talked about it in a little bit of details, it was a transgression that led them out of their naivety and innocence. They lost their innocence. But then after that, Cain brought the idea of evil and sin. Cain was the first human being to be cursed. Adam and Eve, humanity was never cursed. But Cain, as he started to become the seed of the serpent, he was cursed. We talked about Lamech's rebellion. And even after God tried to recreate, to reset after the flood, okay, and we talked about this parallel in the words and the themes, very important themes, between the recreation and the flood and Genesis 1 and 2. But even with this, it was not a pristine recreation, because we can start seeing there loss of harmony. There was fear and dread between humanity and the animals. God said they will fear you at this point. Versus in Genesis 1 where it's like, 1 and 2, come and name them. Very different. We talked about the blood accountability. Whoever sheds blood, by that blood will be accounted for. But most importantly, what is missing in the recreation after the flood, the big thing that is missing, after Genesis 1, we talked about the Sabbath, how God rested, okay, and delighted in his creation. That divine rest is not there after the flood. That is a big difference. Because actually you see him there in Genesis 6, he says, my spirit shall not strive with man forever. So the absence of the divine rest is a big difference between, even though with the parallels that we talked about between Genesis 1 and 2 and the recreation after the flood, the absence of divine rest is a big difference. So then this brings up the question, which is, what will happen to God's presence? What's going to happen in the divine presence among humanity? Because initially, in the initial creation, God was pleased to be amongst his humanity. God rested. After the flood, God's presence is very different. And here we're going to actually have to look at it in a two-way interaction. Because on one side, God has to answer or to declare to us as humanity, how is he going to define the terms of his presence amongst humanity in this post-diluvian world, post-flood world? But then also, humanity has a big part of it. Humanity is going to be part of that relationship. And it's very interesting, and I find this amazing as you look at the parallels between the Bible and secular sciences. Anthropologists have always said, and even those who don't believe in divine revelation, don't believe in God, would say that, human beings are the only creature, they call them the only animal. Okay, well, be it the only creature that has the ability to stand upright and look up to heaven. There's actually no other creature that has that ability. And you wonder, we're created in a way that we're standing and we have look up to heaven. And not just this, that this idea of us being a creature who is able to look up to heaven, they defined us, instead of us actually being defined as Homo sapiens, okay, as the intellectual, actually they said we are actually Homo religiosus, which is a profound sense of universality of us as human beings across civilizations, across the world, okay, wanting to look up to heaven, trying to seek the divine in heaven. And you see this actually very much in Seth. Seth, after he named his son Enosh, it says in there, men began to call on the name of the Lord. That's actually Genesis 5, okay? And you see this kind of parallel between this Homo religiosus. We have that divine need in us. It's a universal agreement, across civilizations, across people. And there's a lot of things about it. It's not just beyond, it's beyond the Judeo-Christian monotheism. There is a sense of us trying to find meaning in our existence. And we look up to heaven. Nobody looks down to earth to define their existence. And especially when calamity befalls on us as human beings, we normally look up to the heaven trying to understand. In fact, a lot of anthropologists would say that humanity is defined by one thing: we are meaning-making machines, okay? Or meaning-making creatures. We have a deep urge to make meaning of things that are happening with us. And when calamity strikes, okay, we look up to heaven. In humanity's search for God, this is beyond just mere revelation. A lot of groups have gravitated towards nature worship. Okay, we can look very clearly at the ancient Egyptians. It was a worship born of fear. We look at the traditions of them actually how they worship the Nile. They would have the feast of actually even throwing somebody to the Nile because they were afraid. There was always a sense of anxiety from the tomorrow, from what's going to happen tomorrow. And I'm trying to find this meaning, okay? But even with those who were philosophers who didn't really subscribe by this idea of worshiping nature, they've always had this idea of the unknown God, and even St. Paul commended them on the Areopagus, okay? He commended them that you guys are seekers. What does that tell us? It tells us that God created within us that wanting the divine, seeking the transcendence in our lives. But not just this. It's not because we're trying to answer an existential question of our meaning and our existence. There is a lot of sense in us trying to make the divine presence amongst us. And we have to answer the question, why? This is the story of today. There are two models, as the Bible teaches us, about this idea of reaching divine presence amongst humanity. There's the first model which God initiates, where God creates in his own image and his likeness, and he initiates the relationship on his own terms, because God is the sovereign God. That is the first model. There's a completely second model where humanity initiates, and it's very interesting. As God has created mankind in his image and likeness, man has created God in his image and likeness. I will say this again. Exactly as God has created humanity in his image and likeness, man has given back the favor to God many times. This is the story of Tower of Babel versus Abraham. And this story, what I found beautiful is that it's a play on words. And this is what I love. What I'm going to tell you today is not anything that you guys don't know, you already know, but you will love the idea how, when you go and attend a play, okay, and you see how beautifully written from a literary standpoint, okay, and the play on the words now, this makes a lot of sense. Today is a play on two words. And in the Hebrew, the words, when they're close to each other, is kind of like almost the pun in those words make a lot of meaning. That's what we're going to be talking about today. And those two words are Shem and Shemayim. Shem and Shemayim. It's both Hebrew words. Shem means name, okay? Shemayim means the heavens, okay? Now let's read the text and also read those words where they come into play. Let's start with Tower of Babel, Genesis 11. And it came to pass as they journeyed from the east that they found a plain in the land of Shinar, and they dwelt there. Then they said to one another, "Come, let us make bricks and bake them thoroughly." They had bricks for stone, and they had asphalt for mortar. And they said, "Come, let us build ourselves a city, and a tower whose top is in the heavens, Shemayim. Let us make a name, Shem, for ourselves, lest we be scattered abroad over the face of the whole earth." It's very interesting. Scholars and commentators and people who contemplate on this ask, what is the exact sin of the people of Babel? What is their exact sin? Because there are so many things going here. They're building something, they're making a city, they're using stuff. What is exactly their sin? And, like one of the things I love about studying the Bible is that, there are a lot of opinions that are not necessarily mutually exclusive. And I sometimes find that sometimes when you gather ideas from different commentators and take them all together, you find a more richer understanding instead of bickering, okay, well, this is the only right interpretation, because the Bible as a deep mystery of the Word of God, I don't think one commentator or one person can have an exclusive say, this is how we should interpret it. But, needless to say, was there a sin that they aggregated together, they came together? Probably not, because there was no actually mandate to scatter across the earth. In fact, the only promise or actually blessing was be fruitful and multiply, was through generation of kids. It was not necessarily that you had to scatter. There was no prohibition from aggregating. It's natural for us to actually want to have a community together. Was it, building a city? Not necessarily, because actually city was part of the civilization that was coming up. It represents human accomplishment. There's nothing wrong with that, okay? In fact, that's another actually beautiful theme. One day we'll talk about it, which is the idea of the Bible itself, what's called from the garden to the city, okay? That's actually a biblical theme by itself. So building a city in of itself has nothing wrong. Was it a tower? All of a sudden they're building a tower. It's so you're building something like the World Trade Center. Is that a sin? Is that something wrong in there? Not necessarily. This was not an ordinary tower. This was something what was called, and this is when you start to compare with the ancient Near East literature, is something called a ziggurat. Okay? It's not a tower. So what it is, it's a conical shaped structure. Usually from inside it's not hollow. It's very different than the pyramids. And on the outside, you have got stairs on the outside, conically going up all the way to the top. This was a standard building in the ancient Near East in Mesopotamia within about the 3rd to 4th century. The purpose of this structure was to basically invite and force the divine powers in the heaven, in the Shemayim, to come down to the earth. So these people were not necessarily interested in getting to heaven, to the Shemayim. They're interested in bringing God down. Very big difference, okay? And not just this. Why am I bringing God down? I'm bringing God down because when I bring God down, I'm counting on God's power to be in my favor. I'm going to use God's power to my favor. And not just this, I'm going to gain control in God's name over the people around me. It was a very, very symbiotic. So remember this word, is called mutual symbiosis. So they would basically there was a resting room for the gods in this structure called the ziggurat. They had food in it, and the whole point was basically, I feed you, you feed me. Okay? So that was this symbiosis. So now, what were they doing? They were basically making a name through power. Strength in numbers, they aggregated, okay, because in their collective power, if they now can take with that their technology of making bricks, that was the first time mentioned of making bricks and using asphalt, and now you're manipulating the divine. When you manipulate the divine, you're using this divine to dominate those around you. So they're establishing their name in order to enforce dominion across the earth, preventing them scattering. And what's the deal with the name? What's the deal with the name? You'll find something very interesting in the Bible. Names of deities is a big deal. There's so many times, and as we're going to study it in future encounters, where there are divine encounters, but there are encounters between humanity and a divine figure, and the first thing that this human being asks, what is your name? And in one time, actually, like when it was Manoah, the father of Samson, who said, like, why do you ask my name when it's wonderful? Moses asked the same thing. What's your name? Jacob asked the same thing. What's your name? What's the deal with that? It was this belief that if I know the name of the deity, I can control, I can ask for favors, I can utilize your power, okay, for my own benefit and service. But yet, when you look, and as we're going to study in future books, God would refrain from giving anyone the name. When Moses asked him, he said to him, I am who I am, I shall be who I shall be. You see the answer? And when Manoah, when Samson's father asked, said, why do you ask my name when it's wonderful? Because God, who's God, is not going to give that knowledge and that power to a mere mortal. Also, because it's almost like another encounter, which we're going to discuss about, when Joshua met the angel of the Lord, and he said to him, are you with us or against us? He said, neither. I cannot be manipulated for your sake as humanity. And this idea between the war between names and deities was very famous. In fact, a lot of commentators look at the plagues were specifically war between God, Jehovah, and the gods of Egypt, because each one that was smitten, each one of the plague was represented by an Egyptian god. Okay? Very famous, the showdown between the prophets of Baal and Elijah. He said to them, you know what? Wake up your God. On the other side, when Israel tried to manipulate God in his name, God punished them very, very harshly. We know the story of Eli and his sons when they tried to bring the Ark of the Covenant in order to win the war. What happened at that time? The Ark was taken and they were all killed. So God was very clear, I am not a God that will be manipulated. You cannot bring me down to earth by your ziggurats, by your towers. So it's interesting in this story, and this is what I love about it, that God is almost playing the game with them. So look at the response, look at how it's written. But the Lord came down to see the city. It's like as if he can't even see it from up there. Okay, the Lord came down, was like, all right, I'm going to come, I'm going to play with you. Came down to see the city and the tower which the sons of men had built. And the Lord said, indeed, the people are one and they have one language. And this is what they begin to do. This is what they begin to do. Now let us come down and confuse their language so that they may not understand one another's speech. The Lord scattered them and they ceased building the city. They ceased building the city. Therefore, its name, Shem. You guys wanted a name? Here's the name you're going to get. Babel, because the Lord confused. Because the cognate in Hebrew or Akkadian is very much like the Arabic, Balbala. Okay, it's the confusion. You wanted a name? I'll give you the name, and that's what you deserve. So divine justice, that God descends, the tower obliterated, the name is lost, the language is confused, and the people are scattered. It's almost like a divine comedy by itself, you know? And the lesson from it is that the primordial mode of attempting to effectuate or to control the divine presence on earth, predicated on human desire and intention and technology, it doesn't work, is inefficacious, irrespective of our strength, aggregation, or technological advancement. So regardless of we use everything we have in order to bring God's presence on this earth, it doesn't work this way. So now, and this is when I was preparing this, I was actually really surprised when I started digging is how the Bible is written. You know how a play between one act to the other, the transition makes a lot of difference. So you see after this Tower of Babel, right after that in Genesis 11, okay? So the Lord scattered them abroad from there over the face. Therefore its name, Shem, is called Babel because the Lord confused the language of all the earth. the verse right after that. This is the genealogy of Shem, the son of Noah. Shem was 100 years. So transitioning from those who tried to fake a name for themselves, to force a name for themselves, to somebody whose actually name was Shem, whom we now look at the descendants of Shem, the 10th son. So remember we said that the 10th is usually that kind of perfection, the Noah's son, the 10th generation, from the line of Shem, the one who carries the name, is Abraham. You see that transition? In contrast to the fake name, now comes somebody who carries the name. When you look at Abraham's context, Abraham, came, you have to realize, he came from the cultural and religious milieu or environment of the Tower of Babel. Because when he left Mesopotamia. It was in the area of Babel. And if we know well by history, so the time of these ziggurats were about maybe 2000 to 3000 before Christ, so 3rd, 4th millennia prior to Christ, okay? Abraham is thought to be about 2,000 years before Christ. So when he was leaving his house and his father's house, he was leaving that cultural and religious understanding of the Tower of Babel, which is basically this divine symbiosis, okay? Tit for tat. God, I can bribe God in some sense. That's what he came from. You go right way. So you go from Tower of Babel to the genealogy of Shem. It ends that the 10th generation from Noah in the line of Shem, it's Abraham. And now you flip to chapter 12. And God calls on Abraham. Now the Lord had said to Abraham, get out of your country, from your family and your father's house, to a land that I will show you. I will make you a great nation. I will bless you and make your name great, and you shall be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you, and I will curse him who curses you, and in you all the families of the earth shall be blessed. This, by the way, is not yet the covenant. This is just a promise. This is God promising and telling Abraham, this is what I want you to do. He was 75 years at that time, so he's not like a young man. And when you look at these words in Hebrew, they're a little bit different than actually the English translation. It's actually two words, lech lecha, or lek leka. Lek, which is the imperative, go, get up and go, okay? Lecha, which is not really translated in the English, which is very similar to the Arabic, okay? Leka. It is actually for yourself, for your own benefit, okay? Get up and go for your own benefit, okay? And leave your father's house, leave your family, leave your cultural background, okay? Leave behind this civilization, leave behind this idea that you can bribe God. So get up and go for yourself. Lich, leka, leka. For your own good. You don't see that a lot in the English translations. They kind of they just say, like, get up and go. And the promise has, leave everything, and God is going to give you several things. We just read them. Number one, you're going to become a nation. Goy. Nation is very interesting because a lot of scholars also debate about this. It's like, it didn't say I'm going to make you a kingdom. It didn't say I'm going to make you a people. It didn't say I'm going to make you family. In fact, it said, like, through you all the families of the earth shall be blessed. He said, I'll make you a nation. What is the idea of a nation? A nation usually is a group of people that are united by a certain allegiance to a common cause. And here God is telling Abraham, okay, that you will become a nation because the people who will follow you have a common allegiance to following the covenant. And this nation can include earth. We are the children of Abraham. It's not a kingdom, it's not a family, like in a big sense it's a family, but it's far bigger than a family. It's the nation of those who trust in God to follow the covenant. You will receive a name, reversing Babel's dynamic. And you will become a blessing. I will bless you, and you shall become a blessing to others. And this becomes very beautiful, because when you look at it, I will bless those who bless you. This actually, those who bless you, is a plural. But when it comes to cursing, I will curse him, singular, who curses you. As if God is hoping that there will be a multitude of people that would receive the blessing and will bless Abraham and would receive the fruits of this covenant. But when it comes to somebody cursing, it will be just an exception, just a singular person. So as if God is trying to say, I hope that the multitudes of the earth get a sense of how beautiful this blessing is, and multitudes will be blessed. But whoever will curse you, I will curse him. But it's even more interesting. The word curse, and we looked, and this is where the Hebrew, because in the English they're all curse. Is this the same word that God used to curse the serpent and Cain? No, it's a little bit of a different word. Him who curses you, actually, the word for cursing, him who curses you is a Hebrew word. It's called kalal. Kalal, which is the Arabic kallil, yuqallil. Exactly. Him who is going to belittle you shall be cursed. Him who's going to belittle you, I will curse them. Why is that? Because God is basically saying, from the time Abraham has the covenant until even later, everyone who's following in this covenant is going to be deemed as little, deemed as small, deemed as ineffective, deemed as the outcast. All the time to our Lord Jesus Christ, right? When he came, they mocked him, they rejected him, they refused him, they belittled him, right? So here, it's not who's going to curse you, but whoever is going to belittle you, because you will be always in the eyes of other people little. But whoever is going to belittle you will end up being cursed. And at the end, in you, all the families of the earth shall be blessed. This actually, believe it or not, this verse, the number of papers that have been written on this verse in terms of linguistically, because it can be translated into two senses. They're both passive. One of them, all the families of earth shall be blessed. They will be blessed. Okay? And the other one is another way, is like reflexive. All the families of the earth shall bless themselves through you. In either condition, it is the blessing is received passively when Abraham and the covenant people are amongst the earth. So what's the purpose of the covenant in this case? The covenant purpose is channeling the blessing into an earth and a land that is cursed and frustrated. Let me say this again. Just after Genesis 3, when God said the land and the earth is cursed and frustrated, God's way of bringing back the blessing to the earth and channeling it is through the people of the covenant. And it's not because of favoritism to Abraham. It is readiness, because as we can actually look into the life of Abraham, it was his readiness that God made him, give him the covenant. Just like St. Mary, it was not favoritism of God to St. Mary. It was her readiness to receive the incarnate Son of God. How do we know that he was ready? Well, right after God, this is not the covenant yet. This is the promise. Abraham started journeying. He left. He came to the land. And it's interesting that the Bible kind of wants to make almost like a disclaimer. You know, when you have a medication and the medication has like a disclaimer, you know, all the written, the fine print. In this, there was a fine print. Because when you got there, and the Canaanites were then in the land. It was like, this is the land God was supposed to promise him. They were there. And the Lord appeared to Abram and said, to your descendants I will give this land. And there he built an altar to the God who appeared to him. Then he moved to Bethel. He pitched his tent. And then and he built an altar to the Lord and called on the name of the Lord. The first response that he's having is, instead of the people who are building towers, he's literally building altars and pitching tents. He's building altars and he's pitching tents. He becomes a man without land in contradistinction to the people of Babel. He sought a God who has no place. He became he had a nomad in pursuit of God. In fact, the only land that he owned was his burial plot for him and Sarah. As if he made the case from all the wealth, the only place you can surely own is your place of burial. Is your place of burial. Not only this, refusing to assimilate. When he had the battle, and we don't have time to go through the whole life of Abraham, but I'm giving you just a little bit of snippets. Going through the time when he had the battle with the kings, when he fought kings in order to rescue his nephew Lot. The king of Sodom, the king of Sodom came to him and said to him, "Give me the persons and take the goods. I will give you these goods." And he said to him, "No, I've raised my hand to the Lord God. I will take nothing, because you will not say that you've made Abraham rich. Because if anything I'm getting it from God." Which is very interesting, compared to Lot. Lot, when they fought on the land, Lot went to Sodom and Gomorrah. Lot wanted to be part of them. Lot left his uncle to be part of Sodom and Gomorrah. And when they went to war, the king of Sodom and Gomorrah, fled and left him to be taken captive. It took his uncle to bring his men to free him. So when you try to assimilate to the world is going to leave you behind. On the other side, Abraham, who had no property that he owned, it is very interesting. When Sarah died and he wanted to buy the burial plot, the people of the land told him, "We would be blessed." They called Abraham prince. They called him a prince. "We would be blessed if you would bury your beloved wife in our land. We'll give you the land for free." He said, "No, I will pay for it." Very different respect. Abraham didn't count his possessions, despite his failings. He was not necessarily perfect. He lied twice to save his life, and lied giving up the divine bride, as we talked about, giving up Sarah. But despite this, he never counted the possessions of this world as means to build a mortal name or a mortal structure. He was rich, yet he was detached. He was willing to give up everything for God. Don't think that the time when he was brought all the way to giving up Isaac, that was his first trial. You have to realize between Genesis 12 and Genesis 15, where God gives him the covenant, this is at least 20 years. Think about it again. I'm going to say this again. From the time God gave him the promise where he told him, "Leave and I'll give you the land, I'll give you the name, I'll give you the descendants, I'll give you the heir, I'll give you all this," to the time when actually he made the covenant with him, that was 20 years. Those were 20 years of Abraham trusting in God and not giving up on him, not accumulating mortal structures like the Tower of Babel, and still believing in God in a very harsh environment. And it's not like he didn't have his chances. As I said, when he won the war, he could have become rich. He could have become a king, just like the king of Sodom and the king of Gomorrah. But needless to say, after this period of time, God came to Abraham, and he came to him in a vision saying, "Do not be afraid, Abraham. I am your shield, your exceedingly great reward." But Abraham's like, after 20 years, come on, He's telling God, "What will you give me, seeing I'm childless?" Like this, the fundamental things, like, where's my progeny? Where's my seed? And the heir of my house is my servant, Eliezer of Damascus. Then Abraham said, "Look, you've given me no offspring. Indeed, one born in my house, that's a slave. He's a servant, is my heir." And the Lord came and said to him, "This one shall not be your heir, but look towards the heaven," Shemayim, "look towards the heaven, and count the stars if you're able." And he said to him, "So shall your descendants be. Those will be as many as the stars." Now, this is the most beautiful part of tonight's talk, the covenant sacrifice. Then God said to him, I am the Lord who brought you out of Ur of the Chaldeans 20 years ago to give you this land to inherit. And he said, Lord God, how shall I know that I'll inherit it? He said to him, bring a 3-year-old heifer, a 3-year-old female goat, and a 3-year-old ram. It's considered that 3-year-olds, those are perfect sacrifice, perfect age. Okay? A turtle dove and a young pigeon. Then he brought them all these to him, and cut them in two down the middle, and placed each piece opposite the other. But he did not cut the birds in two, and when the vultures came down on the carcasses, Abram drove them away. God was establishing the covenant with Abraham. What is the simple idea of a covenant? Is a covenant a contract? Is it a covenant an agreement? Is it legal matter? While the covenant includes all this, it is not limited to all this. Very simply, just like marriage. Marriage has a contract. Marriage has stipulations. Marriage has something you sign on it. But yet, can you define marriage in its core with the contract? No. Marriage is a covenant. A covenant is when a contract becomes a living relationship. Let me say this again. A covenant is when a contract becomes a living relationship. So when we limit God to a set of laws of do's and do nots, we have changed a covenant to a contract. So while the covenant, and as we're going to go into Exodus and Leviticus, has stipulations, that's not the basis of what it is at its core. Because the covenant is the relationship. It's a bond. It's a relational bond. Where God is coming now to Abraham, who trusted his promise, and telling him, we have a binding relationship between each other. And it's interesting, the word in Hebrew, okay, was that we cut a covenant. Karat, covenant. It's cutting. Why is that? Because usually in most covenants, they would sacrifice an animal. Yet this sacrifice that Abram did at that night is mentioned only once in the Bible. Only once. Where basically he took these animals and they slaughter them and he splays them and on both sides. And when you look at this kind of covenant ceremony and compare it to the ancient Near East, what it was basically thought is that when you slaughter the animals and you display them, both parties walk hand in hand in the midst of those cut animals. That is how they establish this covenant. And the premise of this is that if either parties break the bond of this relationship, they are bringing on themselves the curse like these slaughtered animals. Let me say this again. When the parties go hand in hand in between those slaughtered animals, we're basically making a covenantal relationship between each other. And if either of us break this covenant, we are accepting and taking on ourselves the curse and the blame and the death, just like these slaughtered animals. So what's the story here? God told him, get these animals, slaughter them. He prepared them. He now is literally shooing away the vultures and the birds of prey from eating those animals and waiting for God to show up. All expectation. We're going to do this together. And yet God puts him in a deep sleep. The same word we had in Genesis 2, tardema. Remember when I told you that this word is mentioned only twice in the Old Testament? And it indicates a vision of significant existential importance. Back in Genesis 2 was basically the creation of the other through which I am invited into divine unity through sacrificial love. That was the creation of Adam and Eve. So what's the existential reality here? So God puts him into a deep sleep, and horror and great darkness fell upon him. And God revealed to him that he said to Abraham, "Know certainly this, that your descendants will be strangers in the land that is not theirs. They will serve them. They will afflict them for 400 years. But as for you, you shall go to your fathers in peace. You shall be buried at a good old age. But in the 4th generation, they shall return." He gave him the prophecy about the deliverance. The deliverance. So this is a story of salvation. But this is not the end of the story. "And it came to pass when the sun went down and it was dark. And behold, there appeared a smoking oven and a burning torch that passed between those pieces. On the same day the Lord made a covenant with Abram." God walks alone in between those animals. And this imagery brings the imagery of Exodus, which is the cloud and the fire. There is smoke, which is the cloud, and there is the torch, which is the fire. God walks alone in between the animals, while Abram is in a deep sleep, in a tardima, trying to understand what's happening. And in fact, commentators kind of ask the question, why did the horror and darkness fall on Abraham? Like, what was the horror? What was the dread that was on him? Was it that he saw his own children being afflicted for 400 years in a strange land? Was it the fact that God is going to redeem them? Or was it the fact that he came to this realization that he's not part of walking? It's like, what does it mean that the divine God is the one who's doing this walking? That this is revolutionary covenant. Abraham is passive. He's not doing the walking. God is initiating. In contrast to the Tower of Babel, God is telling Abraham, you're going to be passive in this. You cannot call me into this. I'm the one who's walking. And not just this. Even though God knew the righteousness of Abraham, because it was said he was righteous and it was credited for him for righteousness, God knew that Abraham and his descendants are going to break this covenant. And when God knew that they're going to break this covenant, God fully, knowingly knew that he was incurring the curse of both parties on himself. Because he knew that humanity is not going to keep their end. God knew that humanity is not going to keep its end. So this is a prime messianic prophecy, because God knew that they were going to break the covenant. And because he knew that they were going to break the covenant, God took the curse on himself. Do we now understand why was Christ called to be cursed on the cross? Because at the time of Abraham and this tardima, this deep sleep, Abraham and humanity in the form of Abraham came to this realization. We cannot have a symbiotic relationship with this divine God called Yahweh. We cannot offer him some food and offerings and just buy him down here. You're not going to be able to do what the Tower of Babel people did with God. It's not going to work with him. Because in this covenant, only God walks. He initiates, and only him who walks. And he incurred the curse on himself. That could be why Abraham was in horror and dread. Because he saw something that he just couldn't expect. So what are the stipulations of this covenant? Now let's go a little bit forward. What is a little bit of stipulations? Because now God made him the covenant and said, you know what? I am by my own self, I'm guaranteeing this covenant with you. Well, part of the stipulation, God doesn't need our help. You know, the promise and the seed, it's not Lot, because he thought at some point it could be Lot. It's nephew. He's going to inherit him. It's not Eliezer of Damascus. It's not for sure Ishmael, whom you're trying by your own human efforts through Sarah and Hagar to bring. No, it's going to be the little one. What is the little one? The one who is impossible to get. The smallest of possibilities that could have happened, that's what God is going to do. because God doesn't need your help. This is not a symbiotic relationship. What does God require in the covenant? Two things. Number one, full communion. Just like this story, which is kind of amazing, because actually Abuna was just talking about this on Sunday, okay? Just like when he was coming back from the war, and the king of Sodom was saying, let's do some goods exchange. He said no, and he meets Melchizedek, the king of Salem, and he tithed. He took what he was his and gave it to him. What was he given in return? Bread and wine. So God, when we come, and this is what actually Abuna was talking about last week, it's not because God needs our tithes. It's not because God needs our money. God is looking for our communion. It's a very different mechanism of thinking of the divine presence than the Tower of Babel. You cannot buy God with 10% or 50% or even 100% of what you represent, of what I represent. We can't. So the reason for that story is that the communion was offered in response to an offering of love. That's the stipulation of the covenant. Number two, a bodily commitment. And here we're going to have to get a little bit graphic. I'm glad we're all adults. So God says the sign of the covenant is circumcision. You have to be circumcised, you and all in your house. And it's a very interesting thought. Why the circumcision? Circumcision was actually not new for this time. It was not like a new thing. Because circumcision existed for human beings a long time before Abraham. But it was mainly a rite of passage at the time of reaching adulthood and the age of marriage. Okay? So it's usually for adult males at the time of getting into marriage. Number two, it was usually for like a certain elite of the house. It's kind of a rite of passage as like a prince or a king or a lord. Not everyone would get it. And here God said, no. We're going to do something different. Okay? Now, every male in your household who's 8 days shall be circumcised. Why 8 days? We know the significance of that. Because it is the new creation. So God is saying, because the 8th day is the new creation, because in 7 days, that was the original creation. The 8th day is the new. Now, the new creation, with the new covenant, you will be circumcised. And not just the elite of you, but everyone, every male in your house has to be circumcised. The slave, the foreigner, everyone who's adopted in the household. But what are you doing by this? And yes, it is a bit graphic, but you're literally consecrating your body organ that technically is the tool for bringing the seed into this earth. And it becomes a representation of everything as you, as a human being, is bringing to this earth. So whatever you're bringing to this earth, in order for it to be fruitful and multiplied, it has to be consecrated. Not just this. When you are consecrating the organ through which you are perpetuating your progeny, you're entrusting your present and your future to God. You're saying to God, I trust. This is a bodily sign through which I trust my future to you. So it's not just a ritual that we take simply as a ritual, well, they just get circumcised. No, it was an outwardly sign of an inwardly commitment that I'm committing my progeny, my future, my productivity, my fruitfulness. Everything I'm committing to you. And that's the sign. So it's a stipulation of this covenant because it's a stipulation of trust. So now let's bring all this together as the play comes to the end. Now this is the most beautiful part of it. I've got a drum roll here. It was a play of two words, Shem and Shemayim, name and heavens. We had two modes or models of existence, or like divine presence. Tower of Babel, built tower to the heavens, attempted to make a name, a Shem for them, ended up nameless, failed completely. Yet Abraham, the 10th from Shem, in the covenant, he lifted his eyes to the heavens. God told him, your progeny is going to be as multiple as the stars. God gave him a name. What is the idea of the name? In the Jewish tradition, because they think that, or they believe, and I think it's beautiful, that the name of the Lord is so revered, so holy, so sacred, that we don't even deserve to say it. What we as Christians take lightly and say Jehovah, Yahweh, Yod Vav He Yod. In their tradition, because of how sacred this is, they don't even pronounce it. So in the Jewish tradition, God is always referred to as Hashem, the name after which everyone who's named follows. So in their own conversation, when they refer to God, they say, Hashem blessed me today. Hashem saved me today. They don't actually name the name of God because of how much they revere that name. But in their own Jewish tradition, and I got this from a Jewish interpretation. You don't see this in our interpretation, but I thought it was just beautiful. The letter He is usually referring to God for multiple reasons. First of all, it's twice in his name, the Yod He Vav He, okay? And then it is a reminiscent of the divine breath that God breathed into humanity. Because when you breathe into somebody, what do? It's the He. So they think that the letter He is a reminiscent of the divine spirit put into us. So then when you look at the names of those two, Abram became Abraham. Sarai became Sarah. The letter that was added to both names was the He. The letter that was added to both of them was the He. They became Abraham and Sarah. As if after the covenant, God was telling them, no longer you are the old name. Now you are mine, infused with this divine spirit. They become Abraham and Sarah. And the play ends, God's initiative, through the eternal name where God gives them the He. And the fruit of this divine union becomes Isaac, Yitzhak, which is laughter. The divine joy and the divine exuberance, the divine jubilation of the union of two people, which are Abraham and Sarah, becomes Yitzhak, becomes laughter, joy and jubilation. Joy from barrenness. You go from the barrenness of Sarai and the barrenness of Abraham into the fruitfulness of Abraham and Sarah to have Yitzhak. And at the end is a divine celebration. This is the story of when people follow God in his name and his presence. So what's the lesson from today? What do we learn from today? We learn that we sometimes follow in the footsteps of the people of Tower of Babel. Sometimes when we even build a service, build a community, build even a church, build a mission, we're building it for our own name. We're building it because we want to actually take the divine presence in the form of blessing in our lives because we want to be fruitful, multiply, okay? Isn't this the prosperity gospel that is sometimes preached in some churches? But God has nothing to do with this prosperity gospel. God is going to bless regardless of what we are, tit for tat trying to bring to Him. I'm not trying to criticize the prosperity gospel, but I don't think it is biblical, to be honest with you. So we could be invoking the divine presence in many projects that would remain nameless to be destroyed at the end. On the other side, when we truly believe in God, who's a covenant-initiating God, who's a relationship-bonding God, He promises, but He expects us to obey. Our obedience is not necessarily our tit for tat with the covenant. No, it's trusting Him that the blessings of the covenant and the promise of the covenant would happen. But then when the economy of salvation, it is only Him who walks through the curse and bears the curse of us breaking this covenant. That's the God that we worship. A lot of anthropologists who do not believe in God believe that humanity and human beings in different versions created gods in their own mind as a mechanism of survival, because they look as, religion as a mechanism of survival, basically, as a mechanism of making meaning, because they don't believe in divine revelation. I'd actually agree with them. However, saying that, if we would have created gods in our own image, they would all be like the gods of the Tower of Babel. If you are creating a God in your own image, it is impossible to create the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. It's just impossible. You don't have a human drive to create a God like that. Because God like this, who asks you to trust blindly and follow Him for many years, a God like this who wants and seeks from you a relationship of love, not a relationship of checks and balances, is not an easy God to live with, is not an easy God to survive with. I'm not taking this as a proof of revelation, but I find it very hard to believe that humanity can create a God like the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. So it goes back to that original question. When we think of divine presence, it's either God initiating or humanity initiating. The beauty about the biblical revelation is that we don't have to wonder. We just have to follow. It's a beautiful story. So, today is the story of the name, Hashem. I pray that we all live by that Spirit of God that is given in each of us through that divine Spirit. And, as it says in Revelation, it's like, I'll give you a new name. There is a reason why this idea of the name keeps coming up. And it starts from here, from Genesis. Thank you for your attention. Any questions? Or comments, or contemplations? As I said, I was beautiful just preparing this. I enjoyed it. Yes?
It's not a question, it's more of a comment.
Absolutely. Well, let's just get the microphone there for you.
When you were saying the kind of God that we would create, I thought of Greek mythology, like Zeus and Hercules and all that. And, we had to read it in school, and so you would read the stories about how, the humans were the subjects, and they have to constantly serve these gods and pay attention to. And if there were gods that we would invent, since that is what we expect ourselves, is
on
that
our
we
own
want
image.
people want people to serve us, and therefore we expect gods to be just like us in that way.
Exactly. 100%. That's one of the reasons why, actually in the very first talk, I said that big reason why we believe that Genesis 1 is a revelation is that if Moses was copying anything, whether it was the Canaanite, the Egyptian, or the Babylonian, there's no way he can come up with God of Genesis 1 in that sense, because it's revolutionary different than the other gods in that area. Yes, Steve.
Yeah, I think throughout Genesis and Abraham traveling, there's examples of people like essentially seeing him, seeing how he's blessed, and I guess why do we think that, right, and maybe there wasn't mentions of it, but why these people didn't want to follow his God?
It's a great question. So, first of all, some people didn't necessarily follow his God, but recognized the power and the blessing behind it. Two examples. Pharaoh and Abimelech, when they realized the stature of who Sarah is and who they're dealing with in terms of Abraham, they backed out of this relationship. The Bible says they gave him riches and they asked him to bless them. You find this actually in Isaac, okay, that actually Isaac then was asked to bless Abimelech and his household because they were barren. So they asked Isaac to pray for them. So you start to see a sense that they are realizing that these are people who have a certain kind of blessing they don't have. It was too early for them to follow, I'll put it that way. But at least they were seeing this power.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome. Any other questions? Thank you for your attention. So next week we'll conclude. As I said, it's very hard to do Genesis in 5 sessions, but I'm trying to get some of the really strong threads because I know that we all know the stories, but sometimes these threads. And next week, I already started preparing next week. I was really surprised also by some of the threads that put the story of Genesis together, as we're going to talk about it next week of Jacob and his children. So, kind of just putting in a pitch for next week as the last one, okay? All right, so we can pray. Our Father who art in heaven,